September 10th, 2025. North Atlantic, 300 miles off Iceland. At 2:14 GMT, the Russian Yasen-M submarine K-561 Kazan breaks the surface with a sudden Kalibr salvo. Target: USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. 5,000 souls, 70 aircraft, a $13 billion fortress. In under 2 minutes, those warheads are either intercepted, or they carve the first fatal wound into a U.S. carrier in 80 years. And below, the Kazan still holds 32 more. Does the Eisenhower survive the deadliest submarine ambush of the century? Or is this the night America loses its crown jewel? The Arctic in 2025 wasn't just melting ice, it was melting peace. As new trade routes opened, NATO patrols surged north. Moscow called it provocation and claimed the Northern Sea Route as its own. The stage was set. At the heart of Russia's response stood the Yasen-M, a $3.5 billion predator of the deep. 32 launch tubes, Kalibr cruise missiles, Tsirkon hypersonics, carrier killers built to stalk America's giants. Admiral Yevmenov once boasted, "They can strike anywhere, anytime, undetected." Facing them, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, pride of the U.S. Navy, shielded by Arleigh Burke destroyers bristling with Aegis radar and SM-6 interceptors. A floating fortress. This wasn't new. For decades, U.S. and Russian subs had hunted each other in shadow games. Los Angeles versus Akula, whispers of Kursk, fires hushed up, near misses near Alaska. But warnings can only be ignored so long. September 10th, 2025. For 72 hours, the Russian submarine Kazan had been a ghost, a silent, shadowy presence lurking in the cold, dark void 300 miles off the coast of Iceland, beneath the USS Eisenhower Strike Group.
This submarine is considered to be the most noiseless among Russian diesel-electric submarines.
Inside its pressurized hull, the air was stale, thick with the smell of oil and sweat. The only light came from the soft green glow of radar screens and sonar displays. Captain First Rank Alexander Beketov hadn't slept in 2 days. His eyes were fixed on the acoustic tracker, a steady blip representing the greatest prize in the American Navy. He didn't blink. He didn't move. Then, his voice, calm but absolute, cut through the silence. Target carrier. Prepare for launch. The order sent a jolt through the control room. Officers strapped themselves in. Fingers flew over consoles. Initiating a sequence drilled 1,000 times, but never for real. Deep within the boat, hatches slid open. Seawater flooded the launch tubes. At 2:14 a.m., 8 Kalibr cruise missiles erupted from the Kazan's hull.
Meanwhile, the Russian Defense Ministry has published some images, which it says shows the launch of the Kalibr cruise missile.
They tore through the ocean surface, their rocket motors igniting and screaming into the night sky, leaving fiery plumes against the Arctic blackness. The roar echoed inside the submarine for a terrifying moment, before vanishing into the deep silence of the ocean. The Kazan went deep, vanishing once more.
But on the surface, chaos erupted.
On the bridge of the USS Thomas Hudner, the Aegis Combat Systems screen lit up with a catastrophic warning. 8 inbound contacts. Fast. Low. Commander Ryan Mitchell's training took over. He lunged for the 1MC, his voice booming through the ship's speakers, sharp and clear over the blaring alarm. "All hands! Battle stations! Intercept incoming! This is not a drill!" The response was instantaneous. 6 SM-6 missiles fired from the Hudner in rapid succession, streaking into the sky. In the Combat Information Center, electronic warfare officers scrambled to jam the guidance systems of the incoming Kalibrs, their faces illuminated by the frantic light of their screens. For a few heartbeats, it seemed it might be enough. 2 missiles were destroyed in midair in brilliant fireballs. A third veered off course, spiraling harmlessly into the sea. But 5 kept coming. Inside the Eisenhower, a flight deck alarm wailed. Inbound missiles! Inbound missiles! Crews on the deck scrambled like ants, fighting to secure multi-million-dollar FA-18 Super Hornets, chalking wheels and pushing aircraft into elevators. Fire crews positioned foam trucks, their hoses ready. The scale of the floating city became a liability. There was nowhere to run. Admiral John Wade, the strike group commander, stood firm on the flag bridge. His order was simple, a low growl that carried the weight of command. Activate full defensive perimeter. No missile touches this ship. Every CIWS phalanx gun on the carrier and its escorts spun up, their barrels tracking the horizon. The air crackled with tension. Sailors braced for impact, the 5 remaining missiles mere seconds away. But just as the crew braced for impact, a new, more terrifying signal lit up the sonar screens. More launches. A second salvo. The battle had just begun. And this time, the threat was faster than anything America had ever faced. September 10th, 2025, 2:16 a.m. The first wave of Kalibrs was still seconds from impact when the Aegis system on the USS Thomas Hudner painted a new, more terrifying threat.
During maneuvers, the Kalibr missile was launched from an underwater position, and it managed to successfully hit a coastal target.
The radar operator's voice, usually a steady monotone, now carried a tremor of sheer disbelief. He didn't shout. He whispered into his headset, the words sucking the air out of the Combat Information Center. Multiple new tracks, bearing 290, speed, Mach 8.5. God, they're hypersonic. Tsirkons, 90 seconds to impact. On the bridge of the Hudner, Commander Ryan Mitchell felt a cold dread wash over him. Mach 8.5, 9,000 kilometers an hour. The SM-6 interceptors they'd just fired were designed for threats half that speed. The math was brutal and simple. They were almost out of time. The world erupted into a symphony of controlled panic. On the flight deck of the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, it was pure, unadulterated chaos under the harsh glare of floodlights. The shriek of jet engines mingled with the blare of alarms and the frantic shouts of the yellow-shirted directors. Crews, hunched against the deafening roar, were still scrambling to secure the last of the FA-18S when a new sound ripped through the night. The thunderous crack of SM-6 missiles streaking overhead from the escorts, their solid fuel rockets painting white scars across the sky. Sailors ducked instinctively, feeling the concussive thump in their chests. Then came the sharper, faster brrrt of the ship's own close-in weapon systems, CIWS, the phalanx guns, spinning up and unleashing a hail of 20mm uranium-depleted shells at incoming threats, the empty casings clattering to the deck like metallic rain. The air itself smelled of jet fuel, cordite, and fear. 2:20 a.m. Back on the Hudner's bridge, the tactical screens were a nightmare of red. The 5 original Kalibrs were still inbound, now joined by 3 hypersonic Tsirkons, blips of light moving so fast they seemed to blur across the screen. Commander Mitchell gripped the railing, his knuckles white. Focus on the Kalibrs. Let the carrier systems handle the hypersonics. Electronic warfare. Pour everything you have into jamming those Tsirkons. Give them nothing to lock onto. The ship shuddered as another salvo of SM-6s launched from the vertical launch system cells amidships, the deck vibrating underfoot. 500 feet below the surface, inside the Kazan, the atmosphere was a tomb-like silence, broken only by the low hum of the reactor and the quiet reports of the crew. Captain Beketov watched his own screens, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. They had heard the distant, muffled thumps of their first missiles being intercepted, but now their second, decisive gift was on its way. There was no cheering, no celebration, just the silent, professional satisfaction of a trap sprung. They listened as the ocean above them churned with the sounds of American retaliation, their stealthy hull absorbing the noise, making them just another shadow in the deep. But the American counterstrike was already in motion. By 2:25 a.m., high above the fray, at 25,000 feet, a U.S. Navy P-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft, call sign Stingray 01, arrived on station.
P-8 Poseidon aircraft was tracking the Moskva in the hours before the ship was attacked. The U.S. aircraft had shared the location.
Its powerful AN/APY-10 radar had picked up the missile launch plumes from hundreds of miles away. Deploy sonobuoy pattern Sigma, the tactical coordinator ordered. The bay doors opened, and a sequence of sonobuoys, some passive, listening for acoustic signatures, others active, pinging the depths with sound waves, tumbled into the dark ocean below. The ocean was suddenly flooded with sound, a net of electronic ears searching for the whisper of a single submarine. 30 nautical miles east of the Kazan, the Virginia-class attack submarine, USS Minnesota, SSN 783, already on high alert, received Stingray's data feed. Inside her state-of-the-art command center, the sonar operators, wearing headphones that isolated every click and groan of the ocean, suddenly stiffened. Con, sonar, we have a designated track, bearing 275, classify as probable Yasen class. Very quiet, but the active pings are giving us a ghost. Captain Emily Shaw didn't hesitate. Helm, come to new heading. Make your depth 500 feet. Weapons, make tubes 1 and 2 ready in all respects. Prepare for Mark 48 torpedo launch. At 2:30, back on the Eisenhower's deck, the battle reached a horrific crescendo. The defensive perimeter was holding, but it wasn't perfect. One of the remaining Kalibr missiles, its seeker head confused by electronic warfare, veered off its intended path towards the carrier, and instead found a new target, the USS Gravely. The destroyer's CIWS tracked it, spitting fire, but it was too late. The 1,000-pound warhead detonated just 10 meters off the port side, amidships. The sound was a deafening, metallic crunch, felt more than heard across the water. The Gravely shuddered violently as a geyser of water and shrapnel ripped into her hull, tearing a massive hole in her side. The lights on the bridge flickered and died, replaced by the emergency red glow and the piercing shriek of the damage alarm. 12 sailors in the nearby berthing and machinery spaces were killed instantly. 30 more were wounded, trapped by twisted steel and rushing seawater. The scent of burning insulation, ozone, and blood filled the passageways. Seconds later, a Tsirkon hypersonic missile, moving too fast to be stopped, streaked past the Eisenhower's starboard side.
Hypersonic missiles together. This could be a game changer because these weapons are so fast they cannot be intercepted.
It didn't hit. It didn't need to. At Mach 8, the shockwave alone was a weapon. It hit the carrier like a giant, invisible hammer. The entire 100,000-ton ship shook violently. Crewmen were thrown from their feet. On the island, the large SPY-6 radar array groaned, its delicate components damaged by the force of the blast. The lights dipped. For a terrifying second, the entire floating city went dark and silent. Below, the Kazan's sonar operators heard the explosion. "Captain, we have a detonation. Large surface vessel. We may have hit the carrier, but their triumph was short-lived. Their own screens now lit up with warnings. Captain, active pings. Multiple bearings. We are being hunted." Beketov's smile vanished. "Deploy decoys. Launch noisemakers now. Helm, emergency deep. Take us down to 600 meters. Skim the seabed." The Kazan ejected a cloud of acoustic countermeasures, creating a false target, and angled its nose down, diving toward the abyssal plain, its crew holding on as the pressure hull groaned under the strain. On the USS Minnesota, the sonar picture cleared. The decoy was good, but not good enough. The signature of the real submarine, larger and moving fast, was isolated. The fire control solution crystallized. Captain Shaw's voice was ice calm. "Con, weapons, solution locked. Kazan is in range." She took a final breath. "Firing point procedures, tubes 1 and 2, match generated bearings and shoot." The order was given. 2 Mark 48 advanced capability, AD cap, torpedoes were ejected from the Minnesota's tubes. They entered the water, their pump jet propellers initializing with a soft whir. For the first few hundred yards, they swam quietly, wire-guided by the Minnesota. Then, as they closed the distance, their own advanced sonar heads activated, acquiring the target, and they went active, accelerating to over 60 knots, screaming toward the Kazan with a singular, deadly purpose. The sea had turned into a 3-dimensional killing ground of steel and fire, but in the crushing darkness of the deep, who would land the final blow? Because the deadliest strike was still coming, from beneath the waves. 2:41 a.m. The 2 Mark 48 torpedoes were relentless. They knifed through the black water, their wires long since cut, now hunting on their own terrifyingly smart sonar. They ignored the frantic cloud of decoys the Kazan had spit out. Their algorithms had the target's acoustic signature burned into their memory. One veered slightly off course, its seeker head confused by a last-ditch maneuver. The other did not. It struck the Kazan just forward of its massive propeller assembly, on the port side aft. The warhead, designed to detonate beneath the keel of a capital ship to break its back, instead exploded directly against the submarine's pressure hull.
The latest Russian submarine of the Pacific Fleet launched the new Kalibr missile and successfully destroyed a coastal target.
The sound inside the Russian sub was not a bang. It was a universe-ending crump, a deafening, metallic shriek that tore through the boat. Lights blew out in a shower of sparks, plunging compartments into darkness, save for the emergency red beams that flickered on. The deck pitched violently, throwing men against consoles and bulkheads. Instantly, the air filled with the scream of tearing metal, the hiss of high-pressure water, and the shouts of panicked crew. From the aft section, a junior officer's voice screamed over the comms, raw with terror. "Compartment 6 flooding! Seal bulkheads. Seal them now." The heavy, watertight doors slammed shut, a final, grim act that sealed the fate of the sailors trapped on the other side. The chilling sound of rushing seawater hammering against steel was all that was left. The Kazan was crippled. The single blow had shattered its propulsion shaft and flooded the engine room. Power flickered, died, and came back on a weak emergency circuit. The low hum of the reactor and the turbines fell silent, replaced by the ominous groan of the hull compressing under the immense pressure of the deep. They were bleeding air, taking on water and sinking fast. On the bridge, Captain Beketov, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, knew it was over. His command was dying around him. He made the only call left. "Emergency blow! Blow all ballast tanks!" Surface the boat. There was a great roar of high-pressure air forcing water out of the tanks. The crippled submarine, mortally wounded, began a desperate, uncontrolled ascent to the surface. Above, the immediate battle was over. The numbers were being tallied, and they were grim. 5 Russian missiles had been intercepted. One had found its mark on the USS Gravely, killing 12 American sailors and wounding 30. The shockwave from the near-missed Tsirkon had rattled the Eisenhower, causing minor structural damage and wounding 200, though miraculously, there were no fatalities. The cost for the Kazan was even steeper. 18 of her crew were dead, trapped and drowned in the flooded aft compartments. Amidst the smoke and damage on the Eisenhower's hangar deck, Hospital Corpsman Second Class Daniel Hughes ignored the ache in his own shoulders. He heard the cries from a debris-clogged passageway. Without a second thought, he grabbed a fire extinguisher and charged into the smoke, finding 2 junior sailors trapped by a fallen beam, the air around them growing thick with toxic fumes. And deep in the dying Kazan, as the order to abandon ship was given, senior engineer Sergei Volkov made a different choice. While his comrades scrambled for the escape pods, he remained at his post in the auxiliary control room. The reactor was on the verge of a scram, a catastrophic shutdown that could leave them without power and sink them for good. With steady hands, he manually overrode the systems, keeping the cooling pumps running just long enough. He ensured the emergency power stayed on, giving 80 of his shipmates the light and air they needed to evacuate. He knew he would never leave. The Kazan broke the surface of the North Atlantic, a dying steel whale listing heavily to port. Life rafts and escape pods dotted the churning water around her as American helicopters circled overhead. The survivors, including a captured Captain Beketov, were taken prisoner. Their sub, Sergei Volkov's tomb, lingered on the surface for just 10 more minutes. Then, with a final gurgling sigh, it slipped beneath the waves, descending 2,000 meters to its grave on the seabed. The immediate crisis was over. The Kazan was sunk. But the sinking of the Kazan didn't end the war. It only lit the fuse. The world woke up to shock. Within hours of the Kazan's sinking, NATO raised its alert posture to DEFCON 3, the same level last seen after 9/11. In Brussels, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg declared, "An attack on one is an attack on all." NATO naval forces will respond with strength and unity. Carrier groups in the Mediterranean and the Pacific were ordered to full readiness. At the United Nations in New York, an Emergency Security Council session dragged on for hours. The United States accused Russia of committing a flagrant act of war, while Russia's ambassador insisted the strike was a defensive measure against NATO provocation in the Arctic. China and India called for restraint. But behind the closed doors of the chamber, diplomats whispered of a world sliding closer to global conflict. For the U.S. Navy, the psychological effect was profound. Not since World War II had a carrier group been struck in combat. The Eisenhower survived, but the idea that a single submarine could pierce its defenses shook confidence across the fleet. One admiral reportedly admitted, "We've built our strategy on the assumption of invincibility. That assumption is now broken." In Russia, however, the narrative was very different. State media declared the Kazan's crew heroes of the motherland. Photographs of the lost submarine circulated online with captions like, "The steel wall of the North Atlantic." For ordinary Russians, the disaster became both tragedy and propaganda victory, proof their navy could still challenge the West. Politically, the fallout split Europe. Germany and France urged restraint, warning that escalation could bring nuclear consequences. Poland and the Baltic states demanded retaliation, fearing they would be next on Moscow's list. Meanwhile, Beijing watched silently. Chinese naval strategists noted the effectiveness of submarine ambushes, seeing a lesson for future battles in the Taiwan Strait. The oceans, once thought of as silent frontiers, now roared with warnings. Beneath the waves, new wars were already being prepared. And the haunting question lingered. Would the next great war begin not in the skies above, but in the black depths of the sea? Because if one submarine could nearly cripple a supercarrier, what happens when dozens strike at once? One Russian submarine, the Kazan, nearly rewrote history. Its surprise missile strike against the USS Eisenhower strike group left dozens dead, hundreds wounded, and for the first time in 80 years, a U.S. carrier scarred in battle. The Eisenhower survived, but the message was clear. The oceans are no longer safe. The night the North Atlantic burned will be remembered as the closest the world has come to underwater war since the Cold War. Steel clashed in silence, and for a brief moment, the oceans themselves decided the fate of nations. But seas this quiet will not stay silent forever. Somewhere below the waves, another submarine waits. If you want to see how close we are to the unthinkable, join me in the next mission. Subscribe now.